Hello and welcome everyone to this panel on justice-informed species conservation. Today we are joined by Ragnhild Sollund from the University of Oslo. Ragnhild is a pioneer in green criminology and has also recently led a project on wildlife conservation in the Anthropocene. Dany Celermajer, a sociologist and criminologist from the University of Sydney, is also joining us today. Dany leads a project on multi-species justice, which engages with issues of human rights, environmental justice, and justice for the more than human world. We are also joined by Carlos Andrés Baquero-Díaz, a research scholar with the Earth Rights Advocacy Program at the New York University School of Law. Carlos has also worked for the Global Justice and Human Rights Program in Colombia and will be offering perspectives on indigenous justice. This panel will be looking at how expanded concepts of justice may be incorporated and implemented through the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. To start, the Global Biodiversity Framework is an agreement between 196 countries. It was agreed 2 years ago now and is the latest global attempt to coordinate conservation efforts to collaboratively tackle the biodiversity loss crisis. It establishes 4 long-term goals and 23 targets to prevent further species and biodiversity decline. The framework also introduces important considerations to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples, as well as the rights of nature and the rights of Mother Earth. The panel today will consider what these concepts might mean for the future of biodiversity conservation. To start, I'd like to ask each of our speakers to describe what these expanded concepts of justice mean for the future of conservation.
Species justice can only be accomplished if justice is made to each individual animal. That means that she or he should have right to live a life unharmed by humans. And if the species itself is allowed to prosper and live, that means also preserving genetical diversity.
Multi-species justice is a relatively contemporary term, but not a new idea if we think about the way in which it rests on Indigenous conceptions of justice. It starts by calling into question the hierarchy whereby only human beings make claims of justice and says, let's consider that all earth beings, that animals, ecosystems, even rivers, mountains, are the types of beings that can make claims of justice. Part of the claim of multi-species justice is a lot of forms of intra-human injustice, so gender-based injustice, racial injustice, injustice against Indigenous peoples, is entangled with the logics that also drive violence against the more than human.
I'm referring to the need and the urgent need for the participation of Indigenous nations in these scenarios. In many places, like Latin America or Southern Asia, Indigenous peoples have been excluded of the creation of national public policies related to biodiversity, and in some cases, Indigenous peoples' territories and knowledge and sciences are not even recognized.
Now that we have introduced each of these concepts of justice, could you each describe how the Global Biodiversity Framework engages with these concepts and what opportunities and challenges you see for more just approaches to conservation?
So if we start with the first provision, biodiversity is fundamental to human well-being, a healthy planet, economic prosperity for all people, including for living well in balance and in harmony with Mother Earth. So the first thing to notice is that from the outset, there's this clear hierarchical binary between human beings on the one hand and biodiversity on the other. It's a bit morally confused. So there are various articles that talk about what is good for human beings is living in harmony with nature. But right next to those same provisions, you'll see the language of ecosystem services, for example, which again instrumentalizes the more than human.
There is a clash of interest between Mother Earth and her inhabitants on one side, and the vast expansion of humans and their exploitation of other species on the other. Wildlife are regarded as resources that are there for human to use. But there's nothing said about the intrinsic value of each individual animal and his or her interests in living their life unharmed by humans.
For the people who are not familiar with these targets, basically the first three targets are related with the plan and use of global land. Target number 1, establish a plan and manage all areas to reduce biodiversity loss. Target number 2 is related with the restore of 30% of all degraded ecosystems. And target number 3 is related to the conservation of 30% of land, waters, and sea. There is no possibility of achieving the goals of these if indigenous peoples and their organizations are not included explicitly on this legal and political process.
Target 5 is also very anthropocentrically formulated, and it's therefore not so promising. In this Target 5, I see no traces for compassion for the animal victims who are targeted for sustainable use. Concepts like harvesting indicates that animals are like crops that can be harvested, like they have no feelings or interest. The main problem that much of the trade that goes on in animals is going on with sentient beings with the capacity to feel fear and happiness and sorrow and grief and pain like the rest of us. So I think that's one important reason why they should not be regarded as resources. While there may be exceptions for indigenous peoples who depend on certain species for survival, such as the Inuit peoples who need to hunt seals, most of the killing of wildlife is not necessary. People kill animals of endangered species for pleasure, for collections, for trophies, for adornment, for fashion, etc. And none of these uses can be aligned with the word harmony. And I think that such formulations are very out of touch with what we now know about the capabilities of other animals, of their needs, of their interests, and also of their key roles in the ecosystems that they belong to.
Thank you each for your comments there. Could you now go on to describe what you think are the next steps for more just approaches to species conservation?
There's a larger macro problem here that the threats to biodiversity can't be narrowly understood. There are two progressive agendas at work at the moment. One is decolonizing conservation through anti-imperialist agendas where countries in the global south in particular have sovereignty over their natural resources. But that same system of global imperialism and global capitalism drives that type of hyper resource extraction in the global south, which is then in turn one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. From my perspective, the ultimate issue is that the framework, it can't really name the root cause of the problem, which is hyper-capitalist forms of economics and politics that dominate the planet and are completely inconsistent with the protection of non-human life. Those systems are premised on the idea that the more than human will be resource for the accumulation of profit and human good.
As these peoples and these nations are the ones that have been living for longer in those territories, and they are the ones who know how to create relationships between humans and the more than human world, the participation of indigenous peoples and their organizations is fundamental to achieve success on these public policies, rather than trying to bring other type of knowledges or peoples to those places that are now aiming to be protected. That indigenous knowledge and their relationship with the more than human world are the type of knowledge that should be followed and that type of knowledge that should be included.
A next step could be and should be, I think, that the establishment of an international environmental court where governments and corporations should stand and justice for what they destroy. Practical steps that are made, for example, is the European Parliament and the Environmental Crime Directive, which criminalizes ecocide. This is the right step to go.
That about concludes our time for today. Thank you to our hosts at Reverse the Red for enabling this discussion to take place. And thank you to our audience for joining us. It would be really great to hear your thoughts on the topics that have been raised here. So please do take a look at our post-talk survey and do also reach out if you'd like to engage more with this topic. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye.